They say silence speaks louder than words. But what happens when the words you weren't meant to hear shatter the very foundation of everything you believed about your place in this world? What happens when the family you sacrificed everything for sees you as nothing more than dead weight dragging them down? My name is Alice Walker, and I'm 73 years old. For the past 4 years, I've called my son Marcus's house my home. Though lately, I've begun to question whether home is truly what it is. This is my story about discovering that sometimes the people we love most are the ones who hurt us deepest, and sometimes the burdens we think we carry are actually the pillars holding everything together. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning light filtered through the cream-colored curtains of what had once been Marcus's home. Office, now converted into my bedroom. It wasn't much, barely enough space for a twin bed, a small dresser, and the rocking chair I'd brought from my old house. The chair had been Robert's, my late husband, and it still carried the faint scent of his cologne even after all these years. Some mornings, like this one, I'd sit in that chair and wonder how I'd gone from being the woman who once commanded boardrooms to someone who felt like she was tiptoeing through her own son's house. The house was already stirring to life around me. I could hear the familiar symphony of a family beginning their day. The shower running upstairs meant Marcus was getting ready for work, and the sound of cartoons from the living room told me that my granddaughter Emma was already planted in front of the television with her bowl of cereal. She was 8 years old, all bright eyes and endless questions, and she had this way of making me feel needed in a world where I increasingly felt invisible. I pulled on my burgundy cardigan, the one Emma always said made me look like a fairy godmother, and made my way to the kitchen. The morning routine had become as predictable as clockwork. I would start the coffee, pack Marcus's lunch because Sandra never seemed to have time for such things, and make sure Emma had everything she needed for school. It wasn't that anyone asked me to do these things, but in a house where everyone seemed perpetually rushing toward something, I found purpose in the small acts of service that kept the machinery of family life running smoothly. Sandra was already in the kitchen when I arrived, her dark hair pulled back in a severe ponytail, her phone pressed against her ear as she gestured wildly with her free hand. She barely acknowledged my presence as I moved around her to start the coffee, her conversation seeming to consume all her attention. I know, she was saying, her voice carrying that edge of frustration I'd grown accustomed to hearing. But what am I supposed to do? It's not like I have a choice in the matter. I busied myself with measuring coffee grounds, trying not to listen, but finding it impossible to completely ignore the tension in her voice. Sandra had always been what people politely called high-strung, but lately she seemed wound tighter than usual. The real estate business she was trying to launch had been consuming more and more of her time and energy, and I could see the stress etched in the lines around her eyes. Trust me, if there was any other way, she continued, then paused, listening to whoever was on the other end of the line. It was then that she seemed to remember I was in the kitchen, and she glanced at me with a look I couldn't quite decipher before stepping out onto the back patio to continue her conversation. I finished preparing the coffee and moved on to making Emma's lunch. Peanut butter and jelly with the crust cut off, just the way she liked it, along with apple slices, a juice box, and the little note I always tucked into her lunchbox. Today's note read, "Remember, you're braver than you believe and stronger than you seem. Love, Grandma Alice." It was a tradition I'd started when I first moved in, something to let her know that even when we were apart, she was in my thoughts. Emma bounded into the kitchen just as I was sealing her lunch in its bright pink container. Her school uniform was slightly wrinkled, and there was a stubborn cowlick in her sandy brown hair that reminded me so much of Marcus at that age. "Morning, Grandma Alice," she chirped, throwing her arms around my waist in one of those spontaneous hugs that made every difficult moment worth enduring. "Did you sleep okay? I heard you walking around last night." The child was too perceptive for her own good. The truth was, I'd been having trouble sleeping lately, my mind too crowded with worries and what-ifs to find peace. But Emma didn't need to carry the weight of an old woman's anxieties. "Just getting some water, sweetie," I told her, smoothing down that rebellious cowlick. "Are you ready for your spelling test today?" "I think so," she said, though her expression suggested otherwise. "Will you quiz me one more time while I eat breakfast?" We settled into our usual routine, Emma munching on her cereal while I called out spelling words from her study list. She got most of them right, stumbling only on necessarily and occurrence, which were admittedly challenging words for a third grader. We were laughing about her creative spelling of occurrence when Sandra came back inside, her phone call, apparently finished but her mood seemingly darker than before. "Emma, hurry up," Sandra said, not quite snapping but close to it. "We're going to be late, and I don't have time to deal with the carpool line drama today." Emma's face fell slightly at her mother's tone, and I felt that familiar protective instinct rise in my chest. The child was doing her best, eating as quickly as she could while still practicing her spelling words. There was no need for Sandra's impatience. "She's almost finished," I said gently, hoping to diffuse some of the tension. "I can take her to school if you need to leave early." Sandra's response was immediate and sharp. "I can handle getting my own daughter to school, thank you." The words stung more than they should have, carrying an undercurrent of resentment that seemed disproportionate to my simple offer. I bit back my response, not wanting to create more conflict in front of Emma, who was now eating her cereal in silence, her eyes darting between her mother and me. Marcus chose that moment to make his appearance, rushing into the kitchen while adjusting his tie and looking for his travel mug. He was 45 years old, successful in his career as a software engineer, but in moments like these, he still reminded me of the little boy who used to run through my kitchen looking for his lunch money. "Morning, everyone," he said, pressing a quick kiss to the top of Emma's head and nodding in my direction. "Thanks for the coffee, Mom. You're a lifesaver." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. It was a small acknowledgement, but it warmed me nonetheless. Marcus had always been good about expressing gratitude, even for the smallest things. It was one of the qualities that made me proud to be his mother. "Your lunch is in the fridge," I told him, and I saw Sandra roll her eyes, though she tried to hide it by turning away to rinse her coffee cup. "You don't have to make his lunch every day," Sandra said, her voice carefully controlled but with an edge I couldn't miss. "He's a grown man." "I don't mind," I replied, though I could feel the familiar knot of tension forming in my stomach. "It's no trouble at all." Marcus, seemingly oblivious to the undercurrent of tension between his wife and mother, grabbed his lunch from the fridge and his keys from the counter. "I'll be late tonight," he announced. "Big presentation tomorrow, so I'll probably be at the office until at least 8. Sandra's jaw tightened at this news, and I could see her making a visible effort to control her reaction. "Fine," she said, though it clearly wasn't fine. "I guess that means I'll be handling Emma's parent-teacher conference alone. Can't you reschedule it?" "It's been scheduled for 3 weeks, Marcus. Mrs. Henderson specifically arranged her schedule to meet with us today." I watched this exchange with growing discomfort, recognizing the signs of a marriage under strain. It wasn't my place to interfere, but I hated seeing the stress it was causing everyone, especially Emma, who had gone very quiet and was now pushing her cereal around in her bowl rather than eating it. "I could go with you," I offered quietly. "To the conference, I mean, if you'd like the support." Sandra's reaction was immediate and barely contained. "That won't be necessary," she said, her voice tight with what I was beginning to recognize as barely suppressed anger. "I think I can handle a simple parent-teacher conference." The rejection stung, but it was the tone that really hurt. There was something in Sandra's voice that suggested my offer wasn't just unnecessary, but somehow Offensive. I felt Emma's small hand slip into mine under the table, and I squeezed gently, hoping to provide some comfort in the midst of the adult tension swirling around us. Marcus, still focused on gathering his things for work, seemed to miss the entire exchange. He kissed Sandra goodbye, a perfunctory peck on the cheek that she barely acknowledged, and headed for the door. "Have a good day, everyone," he called over his shoulder, and then he was gone, leaving behind a silence that felt heavy with unspoken words. The rest of the morning passed in relative quiet. Sandra finished getting ready for work while I helped. Emma gathered her school supplies and made sure she had everything she needed. The spelling test anxiety had returned, and I spent a few extra minutes reassuring her that she was well prepared and that one test didn't define how smart she was. "Grandma Alice," Emma said as we walked to the front door where Sandra was waiting. With car keys in hand, "Will you be here when I get home?" "Of course, sweetheart," I told her. "I'll be here, and we can practice your piano lesson if you'd like." Sandra made a sound that might have been agreement or frustration. I couldn't tell which, and they left for school. The silence that followed their departure was both a relief and somehow lonely. I stood in the entryway for a moment, listening to the house settle around me before making my way back to the kitchen to clean up the breakfast dishes. It was while I was loading the dishwasher that I heard Sandra's voice again. She must have returned from dropping Emma off, and she was on her phone, pacing in the living room. I wasn't trying to eavesdrop, but the acoustics of the house made it impossible not to hear her conversation. "I'm telling you, Lisa, I'm at my wit's end," Sandra was saying, her voice carrying a level of frustration I'd rarely heard before. "Every single day it's something. She's always there, always hovering, always trying to insert herself into everything." My hands stilled on the plate I was rinsing. The conversation was clearly about me, and I knew I should walk away, should give Sandra the privacy she assumed she had, but something kept me frozen in place, drawn to hear words I knew would hurt me. "No, Marcus doesn't see it," Sandra continued, and I could hear her footsteps as she paced. "He thinks she's just being helpful, but it's suffocating. I can't make a decision about my own daughter without her offering her opinion. I can't run my own household without her taking over. I can't even have a conversation with my husband about our problems without worrying that she's listening from the next room." Each word was like a small knife, cutting away at the foundation of what I thought my role in this family was. I'd believed I was helping, contributing, making their lives easier, but apparently my presence was seen as interference, my help as intrusion. "And the worst part," Sandra went on, her voice dropping but still clearly audible, "is that I can't say anything because she's Marcus's mother, and he'd never forgive me if I told him how I really felt. So I'm stuck. I'm stuck with the family burden, and there's nothing I can do about it." The family burden. Those 3 words hit me like a physical blow, knocking the breath from my lungs and making my knees weak. I gripped the edge of the kitchen counter, fighting a wave of nausea that had nothing to do with anything I'd eaten, and everything to do with the devastating realization of how I was truly seen in this house. The family burden, not Alice, not Grandma, not Marcus's mother or Emma's beloved grandmother. The family burden. A weight to be carried, an obligation to be endured, a problem to be managed rather than a person to be loved. I made my way to my small room on shaking legs, closing the door behind me and sinking into Robert's old rocking chair. The morning. Light that had seemed so warm and welcoming just an hour earlier now felt harsh and exposing. I sat there, trying to process what I'd heard, trying to understand how I'd become so blind to my own situation. For 4 years, I'd lived in this house, believing I was part of a family. I'd given up my independence, sold my home, and reorganized my entire life around being available to help with Emma, to support Marcus and Sandra as they built their careers and their future together. I'd thought I was contributing something valuable, that my presence made their lives richer and easier. but I was the family burden. I thought about all the small interactions I'd dismissed or explained away. Sandra's increasing coolness toward me, her sharp responses to my offers of help, the way she seemed to tense up whenever I entered a room where she was having a conversation. I'd attributed it to stress, to the challenges of launching her real estate business, to the normal adjustments that come when 3 generations try to live under one roof. I'd been naive. Or perhaps I'd been willfully blind, so desperate to feel needed and wanted that I'd ignored the signs that my welcome was wearing thin. The rocking chair creaked softly as I moved back and forth, a sound that had always comforted me, but now seemed to echo with loneliness. I thought about Robert, about the life we'd built together before cancer took him 5 years ago. Our house had been filled with laughter and love, friends dropping by for dinner, children and grandchildren visiting on weekends. I'd been someone, then Alice Walker, the woman who'd built a successful catering business from nothing, who'd raised 3 children and been a pillar of her community. When had I become just a burden? The phone call I'd overheard continued to replay in my mind, each word etching itself deeper into my consciousness. Sandra's frustration was real and deep-seated, not just a moment of irritation, but apparently a long-standing resentment that she'd been carrying. The knowledge that she felt unable to speak freely in her own home because of my presence was particularly painful. I'd never wanted to be the source of tension in Marcus's marriage. I spent the morning in my room, alternating between the rocking chair and my bed, trying to sort through my emotions and figure out what to do with this devastating knowledge. Should I confront Sandra directly? Should I talk to Marcus? Should I simply pack my things and leave, spare them all the burden of my continued presence? The thought of leaving terrified me almost as much as staying. Where would I go? My old house had been sold to help fund Marcus's down payment on this larger home that was supposed to accommodate all of us comfortably. My savings had been depleted by Robert's medical bills and the costs of transitioning from homeowner to dependent family member. I wasn't destitute, but I wasn't in a position to simply start over at 73 either. More than the practical concerns, though, was the emotional reality of what leaving would mean. Emma was the light of my life, the one person in the house who seemed genuinely happy to see me every day. The thought of not being there when she came home from school, of not helping her with homework or listening to her practice piano, of not being the grandmother who tucked little notes in her lunchbox, was almost unbearable. But was staying fair to any of us if my presence was causing such resentment? Around noon, I heard Sandra leave again, probably for a showing or a meeting, related to her business. The house fell into its daytime quiet, and I finally felt safe enough to venture out of my room. I made myself a simple lunch and tried to focus on mundane tasks, but my mind kept returning to that phrase, the family burden. I was folding laundry in the living room when Sandra returned in the late afternoon, about an hour before Emma was due home from school. She seemed surprised to see me there, and for a moment, I wondered if she could tell from my expression that I'd overheard her earlier conversation. But she simply nodded in my direction and headed upstairs, probably to change before picking up Emma. When Emma burst through the front door 30 minutes later, her face bright with excitement about having aced her spelling test, I felt a complicated mix of joy and heartbreak. Her happiness was genuine and infectious, and for a few minutes, I could almost forget the morning's revelations as she told me about her day and showed me the gold star on her test paper. "I got occurrence right," she announced proudly. "I remembered how you said to think about it as occur plus rents, and it worked." "I'm so proud of you," I told her, and meant it completely. In that moment, watching her beam with pride over her accomplishment, I couldn't bring myself to believe that my relationship with Emma was somehow damaging or wrong, regardless of what her mother thought about my presence in their lives. Sandra appeared in the kitchen doorway, having changed into more casual clothes for the parent-teacher conference. She watched Emma and me celebrate the spelling test success with an expression I couldn't quite read, something that might have been sadness or regret or simply resignation. "Emma, eat a snack and get started on your homework," Sandra said. "I need to leave for your conference in 20 minutes. "Can Grandma Alice come?" Emma asked innocently. "She helped me study for the spelling test." "No," Sandra said, perhaps more sharply than she intended, because Emma's face fell immediately. "Grandma Alice doesn't need to come to school conferences." The rejection stung, but what hurt more was seeing Emma's confusion. At 8 years old, she couldn't understand why her grandmother, who helped her with homework every day and clearly cared about her education, wouldn't be welcome at a meeting about her progress. To Emma, it must have seemed arbitrary and hurtful. "It's okay, sweetheart," I said quickly, hoping to smooth over the awkward moment. "Mommy will tell me all about what Mrs. Henderson says, and we'll make sure you keep doing your best." But Emma wasn't easily consoled. "Why can't you come? You help me with my homework more than Mommy does." The words were innocently spoken, but they landed in the room like a small bomb. Sandra's face flushed, and I saw something flash in her. Eyes that might have been anger or embarrassment or both. "Emma, that's enough," Sandra said firmly. "Go get your snack and start your homework." Emma looked between us, clearly sensing the tension she'd inadvertently created, and reluctantly headed to the kitchen. The silence that followed was uncomfortable, heavy with all the things that had been said and heard and felt throughout the day. I wanted to say something, to somehow address the elephant in the room, but I couldn't find words that wouldn't make the situation worse. How do you tell someone you overheard them calling you a burden? How do you have that conversation without causing even more pain and conflict? Sandra left for the conference without another word, and I spent the evening helping Emma with her homework and trying to act as if everything was normal. We worked on math problems and read together, and I helped her practice a song she was learning on the piano. For those few hours, I could almost pretend that the morning's revelations hadn't happened. Marcus came home even later than he'd predicted, arriving just as I was finishing up the dinner dishes. He looked exhausted, his tie loosened, and his usually neat hair slightly disheveled from running his hands through it. "How did the conference go?" he asked Sandra, who was curled up on the couch with her laptop, probably working on real estate listings or marketing materials. "Fine," she said without looking up from her screen. "Emma's doing well. Mrs. Henderson says she's one of the strongest readers in the class." "That's great," Marcus said, but he seemed distracted, his mind still probably on whatever presentation he was preparing for the next day. "Mom, thanks for keeping an eye on things while Sandra was at the school." It was another small acknowledgement of my contribution, but given what I'd learned about Sandra's feelings, it felt different now. Instead of warmth, it brought a pang of sadness for the complicated dynamics I was apparently part of without even realizing it. I went to bed that night with my mind churning, trying to figure out how to move forward with this new knowledge. The house settled into its nighttime quiet around me, but sleep remained elusive. I kept thinking about Sandra's words, about the resentment she'd been carrying, about the impossible position we all seemed to be in. Somewhere around 2 a.m, I got up and made myself a cup of tea, settling into the kitchen table, with a notebook I'd found in one of the drawers. If I was going to figure out how to handle this situation, I needed to think it through clearly, objectively, without the emotion that kept clouding my judgment. I made lists, practical considerations about where I could live if I decided to leave, financial realities about what I could afford on my Social Security and the modest retirement savings I had left, emotional considerations about what would be best for Emma, for Marcus, for Sandra, and yes, for me too. But as I sat there in the quiet kitchen, surrounded by the evidence of the life I'd tried to build in this house, I realized that all the lists in the world couldn't change the fundamental question I was facing. How do you rebuild your sense of worth and belonging when you've discovered that the people you love most see you as a burden rather than a blessing? The family burden. Those words would echo in my mind for days to come, challenging everything. I thought I knew about my place in this family, and forcing me to confront truths I'd been avoiding about my own life and choices. But as I would soon discover, sometimes the people who see us as burdens are the very ones who need us most. Sometimes the weight we think we're carrying is actually the foundation that's holding everything together. And sometimes, the most unexpected, revelations come not from what we overhear in the shadows, but from what people ask of us when they think no one else is watching. The next few days would bring changes I couldn't have imagined, challenges that would test everything I thought. I knew about family and worth and the complicated mathematics of love and resentment. But sitting there in the quiet kitchen at 2 a.m, writing lists by the light of a single lamp, I had no idea that the woman who had called me a burden was about to need me in ways she'd never imagined possible. And I had no idea that my response to her need would reveal truths that would change all of our lives forever. The sleepless nights that followed Sandra's phone call blurred together like watercolors in rain. I found myself existing in a strange liminal space between the woman I had been and the woman I was apparently seen as being. Each morning, I woke with the weight of those words pressing against my chest. The family burden. Each night, I lay staring at the ceiling, wondering how I had become so disconnected from my own reality. It was Emma who noticed first, as children often do when the adults around them are pretending everything is normal. She found me sitting in my rocking chair on a Thursday afternoon, staring out at Sandra's roses without really seeing them, lost in memories that felt both precious and painful. "Grandma Alice, you look sad," she said, climbing onto my lap with the easy intimacy of a child who has never been rejected. "Are you thinking about Grandpa Robert again? How do you explain to an 8-year-old that sometimes the living hurt us more than the dead? That sometimes the people we share a roof with can make us feel more alone than an empty house ever could?" "Sometimes I think about him," I admitted, because lying to Emma had never felt right. "But mostly I was just thinking about changes, sweetheart. How things shift and move even when we wish they would stay the same." She was quiet for a moment, her small hand tracing patterns on my arm with the unconscious affection that had become one of my greatest sources of comfort. "Mommy and Daddy have been talking in whispers a lot," she said finally, "when they think I'm asleep. I don't like when grown-ups whisper. It usually means something bad is happening." The perceptiveness of children can be both blessing and curse. Emma was too young to understand the complexities of adult relationships, but old enough to sense the undercurrents of tension that had been building in the house. I wondered how much she had absorbed, how much damage was being done by the careful politeness that had replaced genuine warmth in so many of our family interactions. "Sometimes grown-ups have to work through complicated feelings," I told her, choosing my words carefully. "It doesn't mean anything bad is going to happen to you. You are loved and safe no matter what." She seemed satisfied with this explanation, or at least willing to accept it, and we spent the rest of the afternoon reading together. It was one of those perfect moments that felt almost normal, sitting in my chair with Emma curled against me, her voice growing more confident as she worked through the chapter book we'd been sharing. For those precious hours, I could almost forget the conversation I'd overheard, could almost believe that I belonged in this house, in this family, in this role I'd created for myself. But the illusion shattered the moment Sandra came home. She appeared in the doorway of my room, her professional composure intact but something brittle underneath it. Emma was still sprawled across my lap, having fallen asleep during our reading session, and I felt suddenly protective of this peaceful scene. "Emma needs to get started on her homework," Sandra said, her voice carefully neutral but with an edge that made me tense. "She finished it at school today," I replied quietly. "Mrs. Henderson sent a note saying they had extra time during study hall." "I'd prefer to check it myself," Sandra said, and there was something in her tone that suggested this wasn't really about homework at all. I gently woke Emma, who protested sleepily but allowed herself to be transferred from my lap to her mother's arms. Sandra carried her out without another word, leaving me alone with the distinct feeling that I had somehow overstepped an invisible boundary. That evening at dinner, the tension was thick enough to cut. Marcus seemed oblivious, distracted by work emails on his phone despite Sandra's pointed sighs. Emma chattered about her day, filling the silence with 8-year-old observations about playground politics and classroom drama. But Sandra remained quiet, pushing food around her plate with the distracted air of someone whose mind was elsewhere. "Alice," Marcus said suddenly, looking up from his phone. "I meant to ask you about something. Sandra and I have been talking about Emma's summer schedule, and we're wondering if you might be interested in taking her to some activities. Day camps, swimming lessons, that sort of thing." It should have felt like inclusion, like being valued for my contribution to Emma's life. Instead, it felt like delegation, like being assigned the tasks that were inconvenient for everyone else. "Of course," I said, because what else could I say? I'd be happy to help with whatever Emma needs. Sandra's fork clinked against her plate with more force than necessary. "Actually," she said, her voice carefully controlled, "I think I'd prefer to handle Emma's summer planning myself. I want to make sure she's in programs that align with our educational goals." The dismissal was swift and complete, leaving Marcus looking confused, and me feeling foolish for having agreed so quickly to something that apparently wasn't really being offered. "Oh," Marcus said, glancing between his wife and mother. "I thought we discussed this." "We discussed a lot of things," Sandra replied, her tone suggesting that this particular conversation was closed. The rest of the meal passed in uncomfortable silence, punctuated only by Emma's increasingly desperate attempts to lighten the mood with jokes and silly faces. I found myself watching this child who was trying so hard to fix something she didn't understand, and my heart broke a little more. Later that night, as I was washing the dinner dishes, I heard Sandra and Marcus talking in low voices in the living room. I tried not to listen, had promised myself I wouldn't eavesdrop again, but their voices carried despite their attempts at discretion. "She's taking over everything," Sandra was saying. "Emma comes home from school and goes straight to her before she even tells me about her day. She makes decisions about Emma's meals, her bedtime routine, even her clothes sometimes, without consulting me at all." "She's just trying to help," Marcus replied, but his voice lacked conviction. "I know she means well, but it's suffocating. I feel like a guest in my own home sometimes, like there's no space for me to be Emma's mother because she's already filled that role." The pain in Sandra's voice was genuine, and for the first time since overhearing that phone call, I began to understand that her resentment wasn't entirely unreasonable. In trying to be helpful, in trying to earn my place in this household, had I inadvertently stepped into spaces that weren't mine to occupy? "What do you want me to do?" Marcus asked, and I could hear the exhaustion in his voice. "She's my mother, Sandra. She gave up her entire life to help us when Emma was born. She sold her house, moved in here, changed everything for our family." "I know that," Sandra said, and now there was something that sounded almost like tears in her voice. "Don't you think I know that? Don't you think that makes this even harder? I can't complain about her without sounding like a terrible person, and I can't ask her to leave without destroying our family. So I'm stuck, and I'm miserable, and I don't know what to do about it." I stood frozen at the kitchen sink, my hands submerged in sudsy water that had grown cold while I listened to this painful conversation. For the first time, I could hear not just resentment in Sandra's voice, but genuine distress. She wasn't cruel or ungrateful. She was drowning in a situation that felt impossible to navigate. "Maybe we need to have a family meeting," Marcus suggested. "Talk about boundaries, expectations, that sort of thing." "A family meeting," Sandra repeated, and there was bitter laughter in her voice. "Can you imagine? Hi, Alice. We need to discuss how you're ruining my relationship with my daughter and making me feel like a failure as a mother in my own home. That would go over well. Their voices dropped even lower after that, and I forced myself to finish the dishes and retreat to my room. But sleep, already elusive, became impossible. I lay in my narrow bed, staring at the ceiling and trying to process what I'd learned. Sandra wasn't just annoyed by my presence, she was genuinely suffering because of it. Her relationship with Emma, the most important thing in her world, felt threatened by my involvement. And Marcus, caught between his loyalty to his mother and his love for his wife, was struggling to find a solution that wouldn't hurt everyone involved. The next morning brought an unexpected disruption to our careful routine. Emma woke up with a fever and upset stomach, clearly too sick for school. Sandra had an important client meeting she couldn't reschedule, and Marcus had already left for an early conference call that would last most of the day. "I can stay home with her," I offered, when Sandra appeared in the kitchen, already dressed for work, but clearly stressed about the change in plans. For a moment, Sandra looked like she might refuse, but practicality won out over whatever reservations she had. "Fine," she said, though she didn't sound happy about it. "Her pediatrician's number is on the refrigerator if you need it. She can have children's Tylenol every 4 hours and make sure she drinks plenty of fluids." It felt like being given instructions for caring for a stranger's child rather than my own granddaughter. But I nodded and assured her that Emma would be well taken care of. The day that followed was both challenging and precious. Emma was miserable, with her stomach bug, wanting comfort and attention that I was more than happy to provide. We spent hours curled up together on the couch, watching old movies and sipping ginger ale. She dozed fitfully, waking periodically to seek reassurance that I was still there, that she wasn't alone in her misery. It was during one of these quiet afternoon moments, with Emma sleeping against my shoulder, that I found myself really looking around the living room where I spent so much of my time. The family photos on the mantel told the story of Marcus and Sandra's life together, from their wedding day through Emma's baby years to more recent pictures of family vacations and school events. I realized with a start that I appeared in very few of these images, and when I did, I was usually on the periphery, included but not central to the narrative being told. When had I become so optional in the visual story of this family? Emma stirred against me, mumbling something in her sleep about wanting her mommy. Even in illness, even seeking comfort from me, part of her was calling for Sandra. It was natural, appropriate even, but it stung nonetheless. Sandra came home earlier than usual, appearing in the living room doorway with an expression I couldn't quite read. Relief, perhaps, at seeing Emma peacefully sleeping, but also something else. Something that might have been regret or sadness, or simply exhaustion. "How is she?" Sandra asked quietly, sitting down in the chair across from us. "Better," I reported. "The fever broke about an hour ago and she kept down some toast and apple juice. I think the worst of it has passed." Sandra nodded, but her attention seemed focused not on my words, but on the scene before her. Her daughter sleeping peacefully in her grandmother's arms, seeking and finding comfort in my presence. For a moment, the careful politeness between us dropped away, and I saw something raw and vulnerable in her expression. "She loves you so much," Sandra said suddenly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Sometimes I think she loves you more than she loves me." The words hung in the air between us, heavy with pain and fear, and the kind of honesty that can only emerge in moments of exhaustion. I looked at this woman who had been carrying such a burden of resentment and realized that underneath it all was a mother's deepest fear that she wasn't enough, that someone else was better at loving her child than she was. "That's not possible," I said gently. "No one could love Emma more than you do. What she feels for me is different, but it's not more or better. It's just different." Sandra's eyes filled with tears she was clearly trying not to shed. I used to be the one she came to when she was hurt or scared. I used to be the one who made everything better. Now she runs to you first, and I feel like I'm losing her a little more every day. The conversation I'd overheard between her and Marcus suddenly made more sense. This wasn't about territory or convenience or even resentment, really. This was about a mother's terror that she was being replaced, that her child was forming a primary attachment to someone else. Sandra, I began, but she held up a hand to stop me. I know how this sounds, she said, wiping at her eyes with the back of her hand. I know how selfish and petty it makes me seem. You've been nothing but kind and helpful, and here I am complaining about it. But I can't help how I feel, and I can't pretend everything is fine when it's not. Emma chose that moment to wake up, blinking sleepily and looking around in confusion. Mommy? She said, her voice hoarse from sleep and illness. When did you get home? Just now, baby, Sandra said, her entire demeanor shifting as she focused on her daughter. How are you feeling? Better, Emma said, but she made no move to leave my lap. Grandma Alice took really good care of me. She made me ginger ale with ice chips and read to me and let me watch cartoons, even though it wasn't Saturday. I saw Sandra's face tighten almost imperceptibly at this catalog of my caretaking, and I realized that every act of comfort I'd provided was another reminder to her of what she hadn't been there to do herself. The rest of the evening passed in careful politeness, with Sandra taking over Emma's care and me retreating to my room earlier than usual. But something had shifted in that brief moment of honesty, some recognition that the situation we were all living in was more complex and painful than any of us had been willing to acknowledge. Over the following days, I found myself paying closer attention to the dynamics in the house, trying to see my role through Sandra's eyes rather than my own. I began to notice things I'd been blind to before. How Emma did indeed come to me first with scraped knees and homework questions. How I had unconsciously positioned myself as the primary caregiver despite Sandra's presence. How my attempts to be helpful might feel like interference to a mother trying to establish her own relationship with her child. It was a revelation that brought no comfort, only a deeper understanding of how impossible our situation had become. I was damned if I helped and damned if I didn't, caught in a web of good intentions and unmet needs that seemed to have no solution. The breaking point came the following Tuesday, during what should have been a routine morning. Emma had forgotten to pack her library book for school, and Sandra was clearly stressed about running late for an important client presentation. I offered to drive Emma to school after retrieving the book from her room, a simple solution that would save everyone time and stress. I can handle getting my own daughter to school, Sandra snapped, her professional composure finally cracking under the accumulated pressure of weeks of unspoken tension. The words were sharp enough to make Emma flinch, and I saw confusion and hurt flash across her face. She looked between her mother and me, trying to understand why a simple offer of help had created such an intense reaction. Of course you can, I said quietly. I was just trying to help. That's the problem, Sandra said, her voice rising despite her obvious effort to control it. You're always trying to help. You're always there, always ready with a solution, always making me feel like I can't handle my own life without your assistance. The silence that followed was deafening. Emma's eyes were wide with confusion and fear, and I could see her trying to process this adult conflict that she had somehow become part of. Marcus had already left for work, unaware that the careful balance we'd all been maintaining was finally collapsing. I never meant to make you feel that way, I said, though the words felt inadequate for the depth of hurt that was finally being exposed. I know you didn't, Sandra replied, her anger giving way to something that looked like exhaustion. That's what makes this so impossible. You mean, well, you're trying to help, and I'm the terrible person who resents you for it. Emma's book bag slipped from her shoulder and hit the floor with a soft thud that seemed unnaturally loud in the tense silence. She looked between us with the kind of bewildered expression that children get when the adult world reveals itself to be far more complicated and painful than they had imagined. "Are you and Grandma Alice fighting?" she asked in a small voice that broke my heart. Sandra knelt down to Emma's level, her maternal instincts overriding everything else. "No, sweetheart, we're not fighting. Sometimes grown-ups have difficult conversations, but that doesn't mean we don't love each other." It was graciously said, but we all knew it wasn't entirely true. We were fighting, had been fighting in careful, polite ways for months. The only difference was that now it was out in the open, impossible to ignore or pretend away. That afternoon, while Emma was at school and Sandra was at work, I sat in my room and tried to imagine what my life might look like if I wasn't living in this house. The practical considerations were daunting. My savings were modest, supplemented only by Social Security and the small pension from my years working in the school district. Finding an apartment I could afford in this area would be challenging, and the thought of starting over at 73 was terrifying. But more than the practical concerns was the emotional reality of what leaving would mean. Emma was the brightest light in my days, the person who made me feel most like myself. The thought of not being there when she came home from school, of not helping her with homework or reading bedtime stories, was almost unbearable. Yet staying seemed equally impossible. How could I continue living in a house where my presence caused such pain to someone I cared about? How could I keep trying to be helpful when my help was experienced as harm? I was still wrestling with these questions when I heard the front door open and Emma's voice calling out her usual greeting. "Grandma Alice, I'm home. Wait until you hear about what happened at lunch today." Her footsteps thundered toward my room, and within seconds she was launching herself onto my bed with the kind of exuberant affection that had become the highlight of every day. For a moment, listening to her animated account of playground drama and cafeteria politics, I could almost forget the morning's confrontation. But Sandra appeared in my doorway before Emma had finished her story, her expression carefully neutral, but with an underlying tension that suggested our earlier conversation wasn't forgotten. "Emma, I need you to get started on your homework," she said, "and I want to check your math problems before you consider them finished." It was a reasonable request, but something in her tone suggested it was also a reclaiming of territory, an assertion of her role as the primary parent in charge of Emma's daily routine. Emma looked between us with the kind of careful attention that children develop when they sense adult conflict they don't understand. "Can Grandma Alice help me if I get stuck on something?" The question was innocent, but it landed in the room, like a small explosion. I saw Sandra's jaw tighten, saw the effort it took for her to maintain her composure. "Let's see how far you can get on your own first," Sandra said, her voice carefully controlled. "I'll be right in the kitchen if you need help." Emma nodded, but I could see the confusion in her eyes. The easy routine we'd established, where she would do homework at the kitchen table with me nearby to answer questions and provide encouragement, was apparently being disrupted. She gathered her school supplies and headed toward the kitchen, but not before giving me a look that seemed to ask what was happening and why things felt different. I spent the evening in my room, listening to the sounds of family life continuing without me. I could hear Sandra helping Emma with homework, their voices mixing in the kind of patient, supportive conversation that I had been part of for years, but was now apparently excluded from. Later, I heard them in the living room, Sandra reading aloud from the chapter book that Emma and I had been working through together. It should have felt like a positive development, Sandra reclaiming her role as Emma's primary caregiver. Instead, it felt like erasure, like I was being carefully but systematically removed from the daily rhythms of family life. That night, as I lay awake staring at the ceiling, I found myself thinking about the woman I had been before Robert's death, before I'd moved into this house and tried to recreate a sense of purpose and belonging. I had been Alice Walker, community volunteer and retired school aide, someone with her own friends and interests and independent life. When had I become so dependent on this family for my sense of identity and worth? The answer, I realized, was gradual and complete. In trying to make myself indispensable, I had become invisible. In trying to earn my place through service, I had lost sight of my own value as a person separate from what I could provide for others. But recognizing the problem and knowing how to solve it were two entirely different things. At 73, with limited resources and no clear path forward, I felt trapped between staying in a situation that was causing pain for everyone involved and striking out on my own into an uncertain future. What I didn't know, as I finally drifted off to sleep in the small hours of the morning, was that the choice would soon be taken out of my hands entirely. What I didn't know was that Sandra's resentment and my growing awareness of our impossible situation were about to become the least of our problems. What I didn't know was that within days, the woman who had called me a burden would be standing in my doorway with desperation in her eyes, asking for something that would change everything we thought we knew about our complicated family dynamics. The conversation that would turn my world upside down was still 3 days away, but already the foundation was shifting beneath us all, preparing for revelations that none of us could have imagined. Friday morning arrived with an unseasonable warmth that made the air heavy and oppressive. I woke to the sound of raised voices from the kitchen, though the words were muffled enough that I couldn't make out their meaning. The tone, however, was unmistakable. Marcus and Sandra were arguing, and from the sharp edge in Sandra's voice, it wasn't a gentle disagreement about household schedules. I dressed quickly and made my way toward the kitchen, but stopped short when I heard my name mentioned. They were talking about me, and the conversation sounded serious enough that I hesitated to interrupt. Instead, I found myself standing in the hallway, caught between the desire to know what was being discussed and the knowledge that eavesdropping had already caused enough pain in this house. "We can't keep going like this," Sandra was saying, her voice tight with stress. "Something has to change, Marcus. This situation is affecting everyone, especially Emma." "I know it's complicated," Marcus replied, and I could hear the weariness in his voice. "But she's my mother, Sandra. I can't just ask her to leave." "I'm not asking you to throw her out on the street," Sandra said, though there was something in her tone that suggested she might not be entirely opposed to that solution. "But we need to have a real conversation about expectations and boundaries. This house isn't big enough for all of us to keep pretending everything is fine when it clearly isn't." There was a long pause, filled only by the sound of coffee brewing, and what might have been Marcus shuffling papers or checking his phone. When he spoke again, his voice was quieter, more thoughtful. "Maybe you're right," he said finally. "Maybe we do need to sit down and talk about this openly. But I need you to promise me that you'll approach this with kindness. Whatever issues we're having, she doesn't deserve to be made to feel unwanted." The irony of his words wasn't lost on me. I already felt unwanted, had felt that way for weeks. Now, the careful politeness, the subtle exclusions, the way conversations stopped when I entered a room, all these things had already communicated more clearly than words ever could that my presence was barely tolerated rather than genuinely welcomed. "I'm not a monster, Marcus," Sandra said, and for the first time in days, her voice carried genuine hurt rather than just anger. "Do you think I enjoy feeling this way? Do you think I want to be the kind of person who resents her mother-in-law for trying to help?" Their conversation was interrupted by Emma's appearance, her feet thundering down the stairs with the kind of energy that only children seem to possess first thing in the morning. I heard her cheerful greeting and the immediate shift in tone, as both parents switched into their roles as loving, attentive caregivers. I retreated to my room and waited until the morning routine was complete before venturing out to start my day. The kitchen bore the evidence of a hurried breakfast, dirty, dishes in the sink and Emma's forgotten homework folder on the counter. I gathered the papers and put them in order, knowing that Sandra would likely call the school later to arrange for them to be dropped off. The house felt different in the aftermath of what I'd overheard. The air seemed charged with unspoken tension, and I found myself moving more carefully, more quietly, as if my very presence might trigger another confrontation. I spent the morning tidying up and preparing lunch, but my heart wasn't in the familiar tasks. Everything felt temporary, uncertain, as if I was going through the motions of a life that might not exist much longer. It was around noon when the phone rang. I was folding laundry in the living room, trying to lose myself in the meditative rhythm of matching socks and smoothing wrinkles, when Sandra's voice cut through the quiet house with unusual urgency. "Alice," she called from the kitchen. "Alice, I need to talk to you." The tone was different from anything I'd heard from her before. Not angry or resentful, but something closer to panic. I set down the laundry and hurried toward the kitchen, finding Sandra standing beside the counter with her phone still pressed to her ear and an expression of barely controlled anxiety on her face. "Hold on," she said into the phone, then looked at me with eyes that seemed wider than usual. "I need to ask you something important. Can you sit down for a minute?" The formality of the request was somehow more alarming than if she'd simply blurted out whatever was on her mind. I took a seat at the kitchen table, noting how Sandra remained standing, pacing slightly as if movement was the only thing keeping her from falling apart completely. "That was my business partner," she began, her words coming out in a rush. "We've been working on this deal for months, a commercial property that could make or break the agency. The financing finally came through, but there's a problem with the loan approval." She paused, running her hands through her perfectly styled hair in a gesture that spoke to just how rattled she was. Sandra was always composed, always in control of her professional image. Seeing her this disheveled was almost as shocking as whatever news she was about to deliver. "The bank is requiring additional collateral," she continued, "more than we anticipated. They want someone with excellent credit and significant assets to co-sign the loan. Marcus already signed, but his credit took a hit when we bought this house, and my business credit is still too new to satisfy their requirements." I waited for her to continue, not sure where this conversation was heading, but beginning to sense that it involved me in some way I couldn't yet fathom. "I need to ask you something," Sandra said, finally stopping her pacing and looking directly at me. "And I need you to know that I'm aware of how this might sound, given everything that's been happening between us lately." The silence stretched between us, heavy with implications I didn't yet understand. Sandra's composure was cracking, and I could see the effort it was taking for her to maintain even this level of control. "I need your help," she said finally, the words seeming to cost her something significant. "I need someone to co-sign this loan, and you're the only person we know who has the kind of credit history and assets the bank is looking for." The request hit me like a physical blow. After weeks of being treated like an unwanted burden, after overhearing myself described in terms that made me feel like dead weight this family was carrying, Sandra was now asking me to take on a substantial financial risk on their behalf. "You want me to co-sign a business loan," I said slowly, making sure I understood correctly. "A significant business loan," Sandra admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "The kind that could put your personal assets at risk if the business fails." The irony of the situation wasn't lost on either of us. The woman who had called me a family burden was now asking me to become financially responsible for her professional dreams. The person who had made me feel unwelcome in this house was now seeking my help to secure her future. I studied Sandra's face, noting the way her hands trembled slightly as she waited for my response. This wasn't easy for her, asking for help from someone she'd been trying to distance herself from. The pride it must have cost her to make this request was evident in every line of her posture. "How much are we talking about?" I asked, keeping my voice neutral despite the storm of emotions swirling inside me. $250,000, Sandra said, and I felt my breath catch in my throat. It was more money than I'd ever imagined being asked to guarantee. More than the mortgage on my old house had been. More than Robert and I had ever borrowed for anything in our entire marriage. the kind of sum that could wipe out everything I'd worked for if something went wrong. "That's a substantial amount," I said carefully. "I know," Sandra replied, her voice thick with what might have been tears. "I know what I'm asking, and I know how hypocritical this must seem. After everything I've said, everything I've done to make you feel unwelcome here, now I'm coming to you asking for something this enormous." She sat down across from me at the table, her professional facade completely abandoned now. What I saw was a woman in crisis, someone whose dreams were hanging in the balance and who had nowhere else to turn. "This business means everything. To me," she continued, "it's my chance to build something of my own, to prove that I can succeed on my own terms. But if this deal falls through, if I can't secure the financing, everything I've worked for over the past 3 years will be gone." I found myself in the strange position of feeling sympathy for someone who had been the source of so much recent pain in my life. Whatever our personal issues, I could recognize the desperation of someone whose professional future was hanging in the balance. "What exactly would co-signing involve?" I asked. Sandra pulled out a folder that had been sitting on the counter, spreading papers across the table between us. "You would be guaranteeing the loan," she explained. "If the business can't make the payments, the bank could come after your assets to cover the debt, your savings, your investments, even your personal property." The weight of what she was asking settled over me like a heavy blanket. At 73, with no ability to replace what I might lose, this kind of financial risk could destroy the modest security I'd built over a lifetime of careful saving. "I need to think about this," I said, though even as the words left my mouth, I was already calculating the implications. "Of course," Sandra said quickly. "I wouldn't expect you to decide right away, but I need to give the bank an answer by Monday morning, or we lose the deal entirely." Monday morning. 3 days to decide whether to risk everything for a family that had been questioning my very presence in their lives. 3 days to determine whether helping Sandra achieve her dreams was worth potentially sacrificing my own financial security. "Can I see the business plan?" I asked. "The financial projections, the market analysis, whatever documentation you have about the viability of this investment?" Sandra's eyes widened slightly, as if she hadn't expected me to approach this as a serious business decision rather than simply a family favor. "Of course," she said, gathering more papers from her briefcase. "I have everything here: profit and loss projections, market research, competitor analysis, everything the bank required for their initial approval." I spent the next hour reviewing documents that painted a picture of Sandra's real estate business that I'd never fully understood. The scope of her ambitions was far greater than I'd realized. This wasn't just about selling houses in our suburban community. She had plans for commercial development, property management, even real estate investment partnerships that could generate substantial long-term income. The numbers were impressive, but they were also projections based on assumptions about market conditions and business growth that could easily prove overly optimistic. The commercial property she wanted to purchase was a significant investment that could indeed transform her small agency into a major player in the regional market, but it could also bankrupt her if the market shifted or if unexpected challenges arose. "This is a substantial undertaking," I said when I'd finished reviewing the materials. "I know," Sandra replied, "but I also know I can make it work. I've been building toward this for years, establishing relationships, developing expertise, positioning myself for exactly this kind of opportunity." There was something in her voice when she talked about her business that I'd never heard before. Passion, certainly, but also a deep sense of purpose that reminded me of my own feelings when I'd built my catering business decades earlier. I recognized the dreams of a woman who wanted to create something significant, something that would provide security and independence for her family. "I need to ask you something," I said slowly. "If our personal situation were different, if we didn't have the tensions we've been dealing with, would you still be coming to me with this request?" Sandra was quiet for a long moment, clearly considering how to answer honestly without causing more hurt than had already been inflicted. Probably not, she admitted finally. If things were different, if I felt like we had a more equal partnership, in this household, I might have approached this as a family discussion rather than a desperate request for help. It was a painfully honest answer, but I appreciated her directness. At least now I knew that this wasn't about recognizing my value or seeing me as an integral part of the family. This was about necessity, about having nowhere else to turn. When her dreams were at risk, "I appreciate your honesty," I told her. "Alice," she said, leaning forward with an intensity that demanded attention, "I know I haven't been fair to you. I know I've made you feel unwelcome and unappreciated, and I know that asking for your help now probably seems incredibly selfish." She paused, gathering herself before continuing. "But I need you to know that my feelings about our living situation don't reflect what I think about you as a person. You're a good woman who's been trying to help our family, and I've let my own insecurities and frustrations turn that into something negative." It was closer to an apology than anything I'd received from her in months, though it still felt incomplete, conditional on my willingness to help her now that she needed something from me. "If I do this," I said carefully, "if I agree to co-sign this loan, what happens to our living situation? Do we continue pretending that everything is fine while we're all miserable?" Sandra's face flushed with obvious discomfort. "I don't know," she said honestly. "I haven't thought that far ahead. Right now, I'm just focused on saving my business." It was another honest answer, but not a particularly reassuring one. She was asking me to take an enormous financial risk while offering no resolution to the problems that had brought us to this point. Emma's key in the front door interrupted our conversation, followed by her usual enthusiastic greeting as she arrived home from school. The sound of her voice brought both Sandra and me back to the reality of our family situation, reminding us that whatever decisions we made would affect more than just the two of us. "Grandma Alice! Mom!" Emma called, her footsteps heading toward the kitchen. "I got a perfect score on my science test. Mrs. Patterson said it was the best explanation of the water cycle she'd seen from a third grader." Her excitement was infectious, and for a moment, both Sandra and I set aside our complicated discussion to celebrate Emma's achievement. She showed us her test paper with its bright red star and enthusiastic teacher comments, and I felt that familiar surge of pride in this remarkable child who somehow managed to thrive despite all the adult tensions swirling around her. "I'm so proud of you," Sandra told Emma, pulling her into a hug that seemed to communicate more than just congratulations for academic success. There was something desperate in the way she held her daughter, as if Emma's achievement was a bright spot in an otherwise difficult day. "Can we call Daddy and tell him?" Emma asked. "He said he wanted to know as soon as I got my test back." While Sandra helped Emma call Marcus to share her good news, I found myself watching this interaction between mother and daughter with new eyes. Whatever Sandra's issues with me, her love for Emma was absolute and unquestionable. This business she was trying to build wasn't just about personal ambition, it was about creating a secure future for her child. After Emma had shared her excitement with Marcus and settled down to start her homework, Sandra and I found ourselves alone in the kitchen again. The business papers were still spread across the table, a visual reminder of the decision that needed to be made. "I want to ask you something else," I said. "If this business succeeds, if the investment pays off the way you're projecting, what does that mean for our family?" Sandra considered the question carefully. "It means financial security," she said finally. "It means Emma's college education is covered, and Marcus doesn't have to worry about supporting me if something happens to his job. It means independence." Independence. The word hung in the air between us, heavy with implications. Independence. For Sandra meant not having to rely on others, including me. It meant the financial freedom to make choices about her living situation without having to consider practical necessities like childcare and household help. "And if it fails?" I asked. "If it fails," Sandra said quietly, "then we all lose everything. Your financial security, our home, Emma's future, everything." The stakes couldn't be clearer. Success meant Sandra would achieve the independence she craved, possibly making my presence in this house unnecessary. Failure meant financial ruin for everyone involved, including the destruction of the modest nest egg I'd spent a lifetime building. "I need the weekend to think about this," I told her. "Of course," Sandra agreed, though I could see the anxiety in her eyes at having to wait. "But Alice, I need you to know that whatever you decide, I'm grateful that you're even considering it. After how I've behaved, you would have every right to refuse without even looking at the numbers." It was the closest thing to a real apology I'd received, though it still felt tied to her current need for my help, rather than genuine remorse for the pain she'd caused. That evening, Marcus came home to find the business papers still spread across the kitchen table, and Sandra wearing the kind of strained expression that suggested the day had been difficult. Emma was in the living room, practicing piano with unusual focus, perhaps sensing that the adults in her life were dealing with something serious. "Sandra told me about the loan situation," Marcus said to me after Emma had been sent to bed. "I want you to know that we would never ask you to do something that would put you at serious financial risk." It was a kind sentiment, but not entirely accurate given what Sandra had already asked of me. Still, I appreciated his attempt to reassure me that this wasn't being taken lightly. "I'm reviewing all the documentation," I told him. "I need to understand exactly what I'd be committing to." "Take all the time you need," Marcus said, though like Sandra, he couldn't quite hide his anxiety about the approaching deadline. That night, I lay awake reviewing everything I'd learned about Sandra's business plans and our family situation. The financial risk was enormous, but so was the potential reward. If the business succeeded, Sandra would achieve the independence she wanted, and Emma would have a secure future. If it failed, everything I'd worked for could be gone. But there was another factor I couldn't ignore. Regardless of our personal conflicts, Sandra had come to me in a moment of crisis. She could have approached other potential co-signers, could have explored alternative financing options, but instead she had swallowed her pride and asked for my help. Maybe that meant something. Maybe it suggested that despite all the tension and resentment, she recognized that I was someone she could count on when everything was at stake. Or maybe it just meant that I was the only person she knew with both the financial capacity and the family obligation to seriously consider such a request. Either way, I had a decision to make that would affect not just my own future, but the future of everyone in this house. The woman who had called me a burden was asking me to take responsibility for her dreams, and I had to decide whether love, loyalty, or simple logic should guide my response. The weekend stretched ahead of me, 48 hours to determine whether to risk everything for a family that might not even want me to stay once they no longer needed my help. Saturday morning brought rain and a house that felt heavy with unspoken tension. Sandra moved through the morning routine with an efficiency that seemed forced, and Marcus kept glancing at the business papers that remained on the kitchen counter like a visual reminder of the decision hanging over all of us. Emma, with the perceptiveness that children often display in the face of adult stress, seemed determined to lighten the mood. She announced that she wanted to bake cookies, a project that would normally involve all 3 generations working together in the kitchen. Today, however, Sandra suggested that Emma and I handle the baking while she caught up on work calls. As Emma and I measured ingredients and mixed cookie dough, I found myself treasuring what might be one of our last peaceful afternoons together. Whatever I decided about the loan, I suspected that our easy routines and casual intimacy were about to change permanently. "Grandma Alice," Emma said as we rolled dough into perfect spheres, "are you and Mommy having a fight?" The directness of children can be both blessing and curse. I wanted to protect Emma from the complexities of adult relationships, but I also didn't want to lie to her about the tensions she was clearly sensing. Sometimes grown-ups have disagreements, I told her carefully. It doesn't mean we don't love each other, but it can make things feel different for a while. Is that why Mommy looks sad all the time? Emma asked, her small hands still working methodically with the cookie dough. The observation broke my heart. In all our focus on the tensions between Sandra and me, we'd apparently failed to shield Emma from the emotional fallout of our conflict. Mommy has a lot of important things on her mind right now, I explained. Sometimes when grown-ups are worried about work or money, it can make them seem sad even when they're not really sad about their family. Emma nodded, as if this explanation made sense to her 8-year-old understanding of the world. Will things get back to normal soon? She asked. I hope so, sweetheart, I told her, though I wasn't sure what normal would look like for any of us moving forward. As we slid trays of cookies into the oven, I made a decision that surprised even me. Whatever choice I made about the loan, it needed to be based on more than just financial calculations or family obligations. It needed to be based on what kind of person I wanted to be in this moment of crisis, what kind of legacy I wanted to leave for Emma regardless of how the adults in her life worked out their complicated relationships. That afternoon, while Emma was at a friend's house and Marcus was working in his home office, I asked Sandra to sit down with me for another conversation. I've been thinking about your request, I began, and I have some questions that go beyond the financial implications. Sandra nodded, her expression serious and attentive. If I agree to co-sign this loan, I continued, I need to know that you understand what it means. Not just financially, but in terms of our relationship and our family. I'm not sure I follow, Sandra said. I'm 73 years old. I explained. This decision could affect the rest of my life. If I'm going to take this risk, if I'm going to potentially sacrifice my financial security for your business dreams, then I need to know that you see me as more than just a convenient solution to your banking problem. Sandra's face flushed, but she didn't look away. What exactly are you asking me? I'm asking whether you want me in this family or whether you're just willing to tolerate me when you need something, I said, the words coming out more bluntly than I'd intended. The silence that followed was long and uncomfortable. Sandra stared at her hands, clearly struggling with how to answer honestly without causing more pain than she already had. I don't know, she said finally. I honestly don't know how to answer that question. It wasn't the response I'd hoped for, but it was honest. And I found myself respecting her for not trying to manufacture false sentiment in service of getting what she needed. Then I need to make my decision based on what I think is right, I told her, rather than on what might make our living situation easier. Sunday passed in a strange limbo of waiting and uncertainty. Sandra made several phone calls related to her business, her voice tense as she discussed timeline and contingency plans with partners and potential investors. Marcus spent most of the day working, the stress of the approaching deadline apparently affecting his concentration on other projects. Emma seemed to sense the adult tension and spent much of the day reading quietly or working on art projects that required minimal supervision. I found myself watching her with a kind of desperate attention, memorizing the way she hummed while she colored and how she automatically reached for my hand when we walked through the house together. Monday morning arrived gray and dreary, matching the mood that had settled over the entire household. Sandra dressed with extra care, as if her professional appearance could somehow influence the outcome of decisions that were beyond her control. Marcus kissed her goodbye with the kind of gentle support that suggested their marriage was stronger than the stress they were currently facing. After they'd both left for work and Emma had been delivered to school, I sat at the kitchen table with all of Sandra's business documents spread before me. The numbers were still impressive, the projections still optimistic, the risks still enormous. But more than the financial calculations, I found myself thinking about legacy and purpose and what it means to be part of a family even when that family is imperfect and complicated. At exactly 10 o'clock, I picked up the phone and called Sandra's office. "Sandra, it's Alice," I said when she answered her office phone, her voice tight with barely controlled anxiety. "Alice," she breathed, and I could hear the mixture of hope and fear in that single word. "Have you made a decision?" "Yes," I said simply. "I'll do it. I'll co-sign the loan." The silence on the other end of the line stretched so long that I wondered if the call had been dropped. When Sandra finally spoke, her voice was thick with what sounded like tears. "Are you sure?" she asked. "I need you to be absolutely certain, because once we submit the paperwork, there's no going back." "I'm sure," I told her, though the words felt like they were coming from someone else. "But I have conditions." "Of course," Sandra said quickly. "Whatever you need." "I want to be listed as a partner in the business," I said, surprising. Both of us with the firmness in my voice. Not a silent investor, not just a co-signer, a full partner with voting rights and access to all financial records. There was another long pause, and I could almost hear Sandra processing this unexpected requirement. That's actually not unreasonable," she said slowly. "Given the level of risk you're taking on, it makes sense that you'd want some control over how the business is managed. And I want a formal agreement about my living situation," I continued. "Not just verbal assurances, but something in writing that protects both of us. Clear expectations about my role in this household in Emma's life." "Alice," Sandra said, her voice softer now, "I think we need to have a much longer conversation about all of this. Can you meet me at my office this afternoon? I want to make sure we handle this properly." I agreed to meet her at 2 o'clock, giving us both time to prepare for what promised to be one of the most important conversations of our complicated relationship. The drive to Sandra's office took me through parts of town I rarely visited, commercial districts where her real estate agency occupied a small but professional-looking suite in a modern building. I'd never seen where Sandra worked, had never been invited into this part of her life, and I was surprised by how impressive her operation appeared to be. The receptionist, a young woman with perfectly styled hair and a warm smile, greeted me by name and led me to Sandra's private office. The space was tastefully decorated with awards and professional certifications, photographs of successful property sales, and a large map of the region marked with colored pins that I assumed represented various business interests. Sandra stood. When I entered, and for the first time in months, she looked genuinely nervous rather than simply stressed or annoyed. She'd prepared coffee and had arranged chairs around a small conference table where several documents were already laid out. "Thank you for coming," she said, gesturing for me to sit. "I wanted you to see this place, to understand what we're really talking about when we discuss the business." I looked around the office with new appreciation for what Sandra had built. This wasn't a hobby or a casual venture. It was a serious professional operation that employed several people and served a substantial client base. "I'm impressed," I told her honestly. "I had no idea the scope of what you'd created here." "Most people don't," Sandra said, settling into her chair across from me. "Including Marcus, if I'm being completely honest. I think he sees this as something I do to keep busy rather than a real career." There was vulnerability in her admission, a glimpse into frustrations I'd never considered. Sandra wasn't just building a business. She was fighting for recognition and respect in a world that apparently didn't take her ambitions seriously. "The commercial property we're trying to purchase," she continued, spreading out architectural plans and photographs, "would allow us to expand into property development and management. It's the kind of opportunity that could transform this agency into a major regional player." I studied the documents she'd prepared, noting the thorough research and detailed planning that had gone into this venture. Whatever our personal conflicts, Sandra was clearly a competent businesswoman who understood her market and had realistic plans for growth. "I need to ask you something," I said, setting down the financial projections I'd been reviewing. "Why me? You could have approached other potential investors. could have explored alternative financing options. Why was I your first choice? Sandra was quiet for a long moment, clearly considering how to answer honestly. Because you're the only person I know who has both the financial capacity and the personal investment in our family's future to take this kind of risk, she said finally. But also because despite everything that's happened between us, I trust you. The admission surprised both of us, I think. Trust hadn't seemed like a component of our relationship lately, buried as it had been under resentment and misunderstanding. I trust that you wouldn't enter into this lightly, Sandra continued. I trust that you'd do your due diligence and make a decision based on facts rather than emotions. And I trust that if you agree to this, you'll be committed to making it work. It was the most honest conversation we'd had in months, free of the careful politeness and underlying hostility that had characterized most of our recent interactions. I need you to understand something, I said. I'm not doing this to buy my way into your family's good graces. I'm not trying to prove my worth or earn my place in your household. Sandra nodded, waiting for me to continue. I'm doing this because I believe in what you're trying to build, I said. And because I think Emma deserves to grow up in a family where the adults pursue their dreams instead of just managing their resentments. We spent the next 2 hours going through every aspect of the business plan, the loan requirements, and the partnership agreement that would formalize my investment. Sandra's attorney joined us by phone to explain the legal implications and ensure that both parties understood exactly what we were committing to. The partnership agreement was more comprehensive than I'd expected, detailing not just financial responsibilities but also decision-making processes, profit distribution, and exit strategies. It was the kind of document that suggested Sandra had been thinking about bringing in a partner for some time, even if she'd never imagined it would be her mother-in-law. There's one more thing we need to discuss, Sandra said as we neared the shatter end of our business conversations. Our personal situation. You mentioned wanting something in writing about your living arrangements. I'd been dreading this part of the conversation, knowing that it would force us to address the underlying issues that had brought us to this point. I don't want to live somewhere I'm not wanted, I said directly. But I also don't want to be asked to leave the moment this business becomes profitable and my financial contribution is no longer needed. Sandra flinched slightly at the bluntness of my words, but she didn't deny the validity of my concerns. I owe you an apology, she said quietly. Several apologies, actually. I've let my own insecurities and frustrations make me treat you unfairly. And I've made you feel unwelcome in what should be your home, too. It was the first real apology I'd received, and while it didn't erase months of hurt feelings, it felt like a genuine acknowledgement of the pain that had been caused. I was afraid, Sandra continued, afraid that Emma loved you more than she loved me, afraid that you were taking over my role as her mother, afraid that I was failing at the most important job I'd ever had. The honesty was painful but necessary, revealing the deep insecurities that had driven so much of Sandra's resentment. Emma's love isn't a competition, I told her gently. She has room in her heart for both of us, for different kinds of relationships that meet different needs in her life. I know that intellectually, Sandra said, but emotionally, it's been harder to accept. We talked for another hour about boundaries and expectations, about how to share the role of caring for Emma without either of us feeling displaced or diminished. It was a conversation we should have had years ago, but crisis had finally forced us to address issues we'd all been too polite or too scared to discuss openly. By the time I left Sandra's office, we had the framework for both a business partnership and a more functional family relationship. The loan paperwork would be submitted the next morning, and if all went well, Sandra's commercial property purchase would be finalized within 2 weeks. But the most important outcome of our meeting wasn't the business agreement. It was the recognition that we could choose to be allies rather than adversaries, that Emma's well-being and our family's future were more important than our individual pride or territorial instincts. That evening, Marcus came home to find Sandra and me sitting at the kitchen table with Emma, helping her with a school project that required contributions from multiple generations of family members. The sight seemed to surprise him, this picture, of 3 generations working together without visible tension or careful politeness. "How did the meeting go?" he asked Sandra, though his eyes moved between both of us as if trying to gauge the emotional temperature of the room. "Very well," Sandra said, reaching over to squeeze my hand in a gesture that felt natural rather than forced. "Alice is going to be my business partner." Marcus's eyebrows rose in surprise. "Partner? I thought we were just talking about co-signing a loan." "It evolved," I said simply. "When you're taking this kind of financial risk, it makes sense to have some control over how the business is run." Emma, who had been focused on gluing photographs to poster board, looked up with interest. "Grandma Alice, does this mean you're going to have an office like Mommy?" "It means I'm going to help your mother make her business even more successful," I told her. "We're going to be a team." The word team seemed to resonate with Emma, who had been sensing the adult tensions without understanding their source. The idea that the important women in her life were working together rather than in opposition clearly relieved some anxiety she'd been carrying. Over the following days, as we worked through the final details of the loan application and partnership agreement, something fundamental shifted in our household dynamics. Sandra began including me in conversations about business decisions, seeking my input on marketing strategies and client relationships. I found myself offering perspectives based on my own experience running a small business, contributions that were genuinely valued rather than merely tolerated. The change wasn't just professional. Sandra started asking for my help with Emma's activities, not because she needed an extra pair of hands, but because she wanted Emma to benefit from our combined attention and expertise. We tag-teamed homework help, with Sandra handling math and science while I worked with Emma on reading and writing projects. Marcus, who had been walking on eggshells around our conflict for months, visibly relaxed as the tension in the house dissipated. Family dinners became enjoyable again, filled with conversation about everyone's day rather than careful small talk designed to avoid controversial topics. The loan approval came through on a Thursday morning, accompanied by Sandra's ecstatic phone call from the bank. The commercial property purchase could proceed as planned, and her expansion into property development and management would begin within the month. But the real test of our new partnership came 2 weeks later, when we encountered our first significant business challenge. The commercial property inspection revealed structural issues that hadn't been apparent during the initial assessment. The problems weren't insurmountable, but they would require additional investment and could delay the timeline for generating rental income. Sandra called me immediately when she received the inspector's report, her voice tight with the kind of panic that comes when carefully laid plans encounter unexpected obstacles. "We can still back out," she said when we met at the property that afternoon. "The purchase agreement has contingencies for major structural issues. We could walk away and find another property." I studied the inspector's report, noting the estimated costs for necessary repairs and the timeline for completing the work. The numbers were significant, but not catastrophic, and the property's long-term potential remained strong. "What does your instinct tell you?" I asked Sandra. "That this is still the right property," she said without hesitation. "The location is perfect. The price is good even with the repair costs, and the rental income potential is exactly what we need to make the numbers work." "Then we move forward," I said simply. "We budget for the additional costs and adjust our timeline accordingly." Sandra stared at me in surprise. "Just like that? You're not worried about the increased risk?" "Of course I'm worried," I told her. "But good business decisions aren't made by avoiding all risk. They're made by carefully calculating which risks are worth taking." It was a philosophy I'd developed during my own business building years, and seeing Sandra's face light up with recognition and gratitude reminded me how much I'd missed being valued for my experience and judgment. We spent the rest of the afternoon developing a revised business plan that accounted for the property's issues, while maintaining realistic projections for profitability. Working together on this challenge felt natural and productive. Two minds, approaching a problem from different angles, and arriving at solutions neither of us would have developed alone. That evening, we presented our revised plan to Marcus, who listened with the kind of attention he'd never paid to Sandra's business ventures before. Having me as a partner seemed to lend credibility to the operation in his eyes, validation that Sandra had been seeking for years. "It sounds like you've thought through all the contingencies," he said when we'd finished our presentation. "I'm proud of both of you for turning a potential disaster into an opportunity." The pride in his voice was genuine, and I saw Sandra's face flush with pleasure at finally receiving the kind of professional recognition from her husband that she'd been craving. Emma, who had been listening from the kitchen doorway, approached with the directness that children bring to complex situations. "So this means everything's going to be okay?" she asked. "And you and Grandma Alice are going to keep working together?" "It means we're going to try our best to make it work," Sandra told her. "And yes, Grandma Alice and I are partners now." Emma nodded solemnly, as if this confirmation resolved some important question in her 8-year-old mind. "Good," she said. "I like it better when grown-ups work together instead of being grumpy at each other. The wisdom of children can be both humbling and illuminating." Emma had identified the core issue that had been affecting our entire family. Adults allowing their personal conflicts to overshadow their shared commitment to creating a loving, supportive environment for the next generation. 6 months later, our commercial property renovation was complete, and we'd signed leases with 3 major tenants. The business was generating steady income and had attracted the attention of other property owners interested in our management services. Sandra's reputation in the regional market had grown significantly, and she was being courted by developers who wanted to partner with her on larger projects. But the real success wasn't measured in profit margins or business expansion. It was measured in the transformation of our family relationships and the creation of a household where everyone felt valued and respected. Sandra and I had developed a friendship based on mutual respect and shared goals rather than forced politeness and competing insecurities. We disagreed on business decisions sometimes, but we'd learned to argue productively and reach compromises that served our joint interests. Emma thrived in the new family dynamic, benefiting from having 2 strong women in her life who modeled collaboration and support rather than competition and resentment. Her confidence had grown visibly as she watched the adults in her world work through their differences and emerge stronger. Marcus, freed from the stress of mediating between his wife and mother, had become more present and engaged with all of us. The successful business partnership had also resolved many of the financial pressures that had been affecting his marriage, allowing him and Sandra to focus on their relationship rather than just survival. As for me, I'd rediscovered parts of myself that had been dormant since Robert's death, and my transition from independent homeowner to dependent family member. Being valued for my business acumen and life experience had restored a sense of purpose and identity that I'd been missing. The woman who had been called a family burden had become a key contributor to the family's success and stability. But, more importantly, I'd learned that worth isn't determined by how others see you. It's determined by how you choose to respond when your value is questioned. On a crisp October afternoon, as Sandra and I reviewed the quarterly business reports in her expanded office, she looked up from the financial statements with an expression of wonder. "A year ago, I never would have imagined this," she said, gesturing at the evidence of our success spread across the conference table. Not just the business, but all of it. Our partnership, our family, the way everything changed. "You never would have imagined asking the family burden to risk her life savings on your business dreams?" I asked, using the phrase that had started our journey toward understanding. Sandra winced at the reminder of her words, but she didn't look away. "I never would have imagined that the person I saw as an obstacle would become my most important ally," she said. "Or that working together would make both of us stronger than we were separately." It was a lesson that extended far beyond business partnerships or family relationships. Sometimes the people we perceive as burdens are actually the foundations that make everything else possible. Sometimes the greatest opportunities come disguised as the most difficult challenges. Emma bounded into the office at that moment, home from school and eager to share the news that she'd been selected for the advanced reading program. As she threw her arms around both Sandra and me with equal enthusiasm, I was reminded that this child had never seen us as competitors for her affection. She had simply been waiting for the adults in her life to figure out what she'd known all along, that love multiplies when it's shared rather than hoarded. "Are we going to celebrate?" Emma asked, looking between her mother and grandmother with the kind of expectation that comes from living in a household where achievements are recognized and joy is shared. "Absolutely," Sandra said, closing the laptop that contained our business plans and focusing entirely on her daughter. What kind of celebration does an advanced reader deserve? As we planned Emma's celebration dinner and discussed the weekend activities that would mark this milestone in her education, reflected on how different this scene was from the careful, polite interactions that had characterized our family just months earlier. The change hadn't happened because anyone became a different person. Sandra was still ambitious and sometimes insecure. I was still opinionated and occasionally interfering. Marcus was still focused on work and sometimes oblivious to family dynamics. But we'd learned to see each other's qualities as assets rather than liabilities, to approach our differences as opportunities for growth rather than sources of conflict. Most importantly, we'd learned that family isn't just about blood relations or shared history. It's about choosing to build something together that's stronger than what any individual could create alone. The commercial property that had started as Sandra's dream had become our shared success. The loan that I'd co-signed as a desperate favor had evolved into a profitable partnership. The family tensions that had threatened to tear us apart had ultimately brought us closer together. As we left the office that afternoon, walking to our cars with Emma chattering about her reading program and her plans for the weekend, Sandra turned to me with an expression of gratitude that needed no words. "Thank you," she said simply, "for everything. Thank you for giving me the chance to prove that burdens can become blessings when we're willing to see them differently," I replied. Emma, skipping ahead of us toward Sandra's car, called back with the kind of casual observation that children make when they're happy and secure. "I love having two moms who work together." Two moms. It was a description that would have terrified Sandra a year ago, but now it just made her smile. She'd learned that sharing the role of caring for Emma didn't diminish her importance in her daughter's life. It enriched it. That evening, as our family gathered around the dinner table to celebrate Emma's achievement, I looked around at these faces that had become so dear to me and marveled at the journey that had brought us to this point. Marcus raised his glass in a toast to Emma's academic success, but his eyes included both Sandra and me in the gesture of celebration. Sandra reached over to squeeze my hand as we applauded Emma's accomplishment, a gesture that had become natural rather than forced. Emma beamed with the kind of pure happiness that comes from being surrounded by adults who are genuinely proud of her achievements and genuinely committed to her well-being. The family burden had become the family foundation, but more importantly, we'd all learned that labels matter less than love, that perception matters less than reality, and that sometimes the greatest gifts come wrapped in the most unexpected packages. As I tucked Emma into bed that night, listening to her excited plans for her advanced reading program and her dreams for the future, I realized that this child would grow up with a different understanding of family than I'd had at her age. She would know that families can be complicated and still be loving, that adults can disagree and still support each other, that problems can become opportunities when people are willing to work together toward solutions. Most importantly, she would know that every person in a family has value, that everyone's contributions matter, and that love isn't diminished by being shared broadly rather than held tightly. "Grandma Alice," Emma said sleepily as I kissed her, "Good night. I'm glad you and Mommy are friends now. It makes everything better." Me too, sweetheart, I told her. Me too. As I turned off her light and made my way back to my room, I reflected on how dramatically my life had changed since that devastating morning when I'd overheard Sandra's phone call. The woman who had called me a burden had ultimately given me the greatest gift, the opportunity to prove my worth not just to her, but to myself. The business partnership that had started as a desperate request for help had evolved into genuine collaboration and friendship. The family tensions that had threatened to tear us apart had ultimately taught us how to build something stronger and more resilient. At 73, I'd discovered that it's never too late to redefine your role in other people's lives. Never too late to transform burden into blessing. Never too late to prove that the most valuable contributions often come from the most unexpected sources. The family burden had become the family foundation, and in that transformation, we'd all learned something precious about the true meaning of love, loyalty, and the courage it takes to see beyond surface appearances to the deeper truths that bind us together. 2 years have passed since that October afternoon when Emma celebrated her selection for the advanced reading program, and the changes in our family continued to ripple outward in ways I never could have anticipated. What began as a crisis of belonging has evolved into something far more profound, a complete reimagining of what family can be when built on mutual respect rather than obligation, on collaboration rather than competition. The business Sandra and I created together has exceeded every projection we made in those early days of desperate planning. Our commercial property now houses 12 thriving businesses, and we've expanded to manage properties throughout the ME region. More importantly, we've become known for our innovative approach to property development, creating spaces that serve communities rather than simply generating profit. It's the kind of legacy I never imagined building at this stage of my life, and yet it feels like the natural culmination of everything I learned during my years of smaller ventures and community involvement. But success in business, while gratifying, pales in comparison to the transformation in our family relationships. Sandra and I have developed the kind of friendship I never thought possible during those dark months when every interaction felt like walking through a minefield. We've learned to disagree productively, to challenge each other's ideas without challenging each other's worth, to build something together that neither of us could have created alone. Last month, Sandra surprised me by suggesting we write a book together about multi-generational entrepreneurship. Who else would understand the complexities of being business partners with your mother-in-law? She asked, laughing at the absurdity of our situation. The laughter itself was a miracle, considering how much pain that relationship had once caused, both of us. Emma, now 10 years old, has grown into a confident, compassionate child who seems to navigate the world with an unusual understanding of how complex relationships can be both challenging and rewarding. She talks casually about having 2 business moms and seems to take pride in our partnership rather than confusion about our roles. Just last week, she announced that she wants to be an entrepreneur when she grows up, like Mommy and Grandma, Alice, because they show that women can build anything they set their minds to. The wisdom in that statement, coming from a 10-year-old, reminded me that children absorb lessons from what they witness far more than from what they're told. Emma has spent the past 2 years watching 2 women work through conflict to create collaboration, watching adults admit mistakes and change their behavior, watching a family choose growth over grudges. Those lessons will serve her well throughout her life. Marcus has perhaps benefited most from the resolution of our family tensions. For months, he carried the impossible burden of trying to keep peace between his wife and mother without fully understanding the source of their conflict. Now, freed from that stress, he's become more present in all our lives. He's taken a more active role in the business, handling our legal and financial compliance, and he's developed his own relationship with Emma that doesn't compete with ours, but complements them. The 3-generation partnership we've created has become something of a local legend. Other families have reached out, asking for advice about navigating similar multi-generational living situations or business partnerships. Sandra and I have found ourselves speaking at women's business groups and family counseling organizations, sharing our story as an example of how crisis can become opportunity when people are willing to do the hard work of honest communication. One of the most profound changes has been in how I see myself and my place in the world. For the first year after Robert's death, I defined myself primarily by what I'd lost: wife, homeowner, independent woman. During my early years in Marcus's house, I defined myself by what I could provide: childcare, household management, emotional support. It took nearly losing everything to discover that my real value lay in qualities I'd almost forgotten I possessed: business acumen, life experience, the ability to see opportunities where others saw only problems. At 75, I own a successful business, have a partnership that continues to grow and evolve, and wake up each morning with a sense of purpose that goes far beyond family obligations. I'm not just Alice Walker, Marcus's mother or Emma's grandmother. I'm Alice Walker, business owner, problem solver, woman who refused to let other people's perceptions define her worth. The financial security that comes with business success has transformed not just my personal circumstances, but our entire family's future. Emma's college education is now fully funded, with money left over for graduate school if she chooses that path. Marcus and Sandra have been able to pay off their mortgage early and are considering purchasing a vacation home where our extended family can gather for holidays and celebrations. But more than the financial benefits, our success has given all of us something invaluable: proof that it's possible to change deeply entrenched patterns, to transform relationships that seem hopelessly damaged, to build something beautiful from the ruins of conflict and misunderstanding. The house that once felt like a battlefield of competing needs and unspoken resentments has become a true home where everyone's contributions are valued and everyone's voice is heard. We've developed new traditions that reflect our evolved relationships. Weekly business meetings where Emma gets to offer her perspective on marketing ideas, family dinners where we celebrate both personal and professional achievements, and holiday gatherings that now include Sandra's parents and siblings, who have become genuinely fond of the mother-in-law they once saw as an intrusion in their daughter's marriage. Sandra's relationship with her own parents has improved significantly as well, partly because our partnership has given her the confidence to set boundaries and communicate her needs more clearly. She's no longer the struggling mother trying to prove her competence. She's a successful businesswoman who's learned to value collaboration over independence, to see asking for help as strength rather than weakness. The ripple effects of our transformation have touched other relationships, too. I've reconnected with old friends who admired my courage in starting a new business venture at my age. Some of them have been inspired to pursue their own delayed dreams, proving that it's never too late to reinvent yourself if you're willing to take risks and do the work required for change. Emma's friends are fascinated by our family structure and often ask if their grandparents could start businesses too. Their innocent questions have led to several conversations with other families about the untapped potential that exists when different generations combine their strengths rather than simply tolerating each other's presence. The physical changes in our house reflect the emotional changes in our relationships. Sandra insisted on converting the largest bedroom upstairs into a proper suite for me, complete with a sitting area, updated bathroom, and space for a home office where I can work on business matters without feeling like I'm intruding on family spaces. The gesture wasn't just about comfort. It was about recognition and respect, acknowledgement that this is truly my home rather than simply a place where I'm temporarily housed. We've also created a family office in what used to be the formal dining room, a space where Sandra and I can work together on business matters while still being available for Emma's after-school needs. The room has become a symbol of our partnership, filled with both business documents and family photos, professional awards, and Emma's artwork, representing the seamless integration of our personal and professional lives. The challenges we've faced haven't disappeared entirely. Running a business with a family member requires constant attention to communication and boundary setting. There are still moments when our different generational perspectives create friction, when Sandra's innovative approaches clash with my more traditional methods, when the stress of business decisions affects our family dynamics. But we've developed tools for navigating these challenges that didn't exist during our early months of conflict. We have regular family meetings where everyone can voice concerns and contribute to solutions. We've established protocols for business disagreements that keep professional disputes from spilling over into personal relationships. Most importantly, we've learned to approach problems as opportunities for growth rather than threats to our fragile peace. One of the most significant lessons we've learned is that love and respect aren't finite resources that diminish when shared. Sandra's fear that Emma loved me more than her was based on the mistaken belief that a child's affection is a zero-sum game. In reality, Emma's capacity for love has only grown as she's watched the adults in her life model healthy relationships and collaborative problem-solving. Emma now has 2 strong female role models who show her different ways of navigating the world, different approaches to challenge and opportunity, different styles of leadership and communication. Rather than being confused by these differences, she's learned to appreciate them and to incorporate the best of both approaches into her own developing personality. The transformation in our family has also influenced how we approach other relationships and community involvement. Sandra and I have become active in local women's business organizations, mentoring other entrepreneurs and sharing our experience with multi-generational partnerships. We've discovered that our story resonates with many people who are struggling to balance family obligations with personal dreams, who feel trapped between competing loyalties and unmet needs. Our speaking engagements have led to consulting opportunities, helping other families navigate similar transitions and business partnerships. It's work that feels meaningful beyond the financial compensation, work that allows us to use our hard-won wisdom to prevent others from experiencing the pain we went through during our months of conflict and misunderstanding. Emma has become something of a junior ambassador for our partnership, often accompanying us to speaking events and sharing her perspective on what it's like to grow up in a household where adults work together rather than against each other. Her insights are remarkably sophisticated for a 10-year-old, and her presence adds authenticity to our message about the importance of considering children's needs when adults are working through relationship challenges. The commercial property that started our business journey has become more than just an investment. It's become a symbol of what's possible when people are willing to take risks for each other. We've used the space to host events for other women entrepreneurs, to provide affordable office space for startup businesses, to create a community hub that reflects our values of collaboration and mutual support. 3 of our original tenants have expanded their businesses significantly since moving into our property, and 2 have become close friends who've been integrated into our extended family network. The relationships we've built through business have enriched our personal lives in ways we never anticipated, creating a community of support that extends far beyond our immediate family. The financial independence our business has provided has also given me the freedom to be more generous with causes I care about. I've established a scholarship fund for older women who want to start businesses, recognizing that age discrimination in lending and investment can make it difficult for women my age to access the capital they need to pursue their dreams. Sandra has used her success to expand her involvement in affordable housing initiatives, applying the skills we've developed in commercial property management to projects that serve lower-income families. It's work that gives her a sense of purpose beyond profit, and it's taught Emma important lessons about using success to benefit others. The partnership that began as a desperate request for financial help has evolved into something that serves our community as well as our family. We've created jobs, supported other businesses, contributed to local economic development, and demonstrated that age and family relationships don't have to be barriers to entrepreneurial success. Looking back on the woman I was 2 years ago, sitting in my small bedroom and feeling like a burden on my family, I can hardly recognize her. That woman was defined by loss and limitation, by what she couldn't do rather than what she could contribute. The woman I am today is defined by possibility and partnership, by the knowledge that it's never too late to discover new aspects of yourself and new ways of contributing to the world. The journey from burden to blessing wasn't easy or quick. It required both Sandra and me to examine our own insecurities and prejudices, to admit mistakes and change behaviors that had become habitual, to risk vulnerability in service of creating something better. It required Marcus to step out of his role as peacekeeper and become an active participant in our family's transformation. Most importantly, it required all of us to prioritize Emma's well-being over our own comfort zones. The lessons we've learned extend far beyond our specific situation. We've discovered that most family conflicts are rooted in unexamined assumptions and unspoken fears, that honest communication can resolve problems that seem insurmountable, that collaboration creates better outcomes than competition, and that love really does multiply when it's shared rather than hoarded. We've also learned that change is possible at any age, that it's never too late to redefine relationships and reimagine possibilities, that crisis can become opportunity when people are willing to do the hard work of growth and understanding. As I write this conclusion to our story, I'm sitting in the home office that represents so much more than just a place to work. It represents recognition and respect, partnership and possibility, the transformation of a woman who was once seen as a burden into someone who's recognized as essential to her family's success and happiness. Emma is at the kitchen table, working on a school project about entrepreneurs who've made a difference in their communities. She's chosen to write about Sandra and me, and she's already announced that she wants to interview other family business partnerships for comparison. Her teacher is so impressed with her research skills and insight that she's recommended Emma for the Gifted and Talented program. Sandra is in our shared office, preparing for a presentation to potential investors who want to fund our expansion into sustainable housing development. The confidence with which she approaches these opportunities still amazes me, remembering the stressed, resentful woman who once saw my presence as a threat to her competence and authority. Marcus is reviewing the legal documents for our latest property acquisition, his expertise invaluable to our continued growth. The man who once walked on eggshells around our conflict has become an integral part of our success, his own talents finally recognized and utilized. This is what family can be when built on mutual respect rather than obligation, when each person's contributions are valued rather than taken for granted, when love is expressed through action rather than just words. This is what's possible when people are willing to look beyond surface conflicts to address underlying needs and fears. The woman who was once called a family burden has become the foundation upon which our family's future is built. But more importantly, we've all learned that labels are temporary, that perception can be changed, and that the most profound transformations often begin with the willingness to see ourselves and each other differently. Our story continues to evolve, filled with new challenges and opportunities, new ways of growing and contributing, new possibilities for making a difference in our own lives and in the lives of others. The ending isn't really an ending at all. It's a new beginning, a launching point for whatever adventures await us as we continue to build something beautiful together. The family burden became the family blessing, but the real miracle is that we all learned how to see the blessings that were there all along. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.